everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education, and welcome to another episode of PDE TV. I'm really excited about the guest that we have for you today because I've known him for a long time and I admire his work greatly. You may or may not be familiar with him, but I suspect that you are familiar with the words school choice. And so Corey DeAngelis is joining us. And it's hard to talk about school choice currently without his name coming up. So Corey is the senior fellow at the American Federation for Children. He is a self-proclaimed school choice evangelist, and he is the co-author of a new book entitled Mediocrity, 40 Ways Government Schools Are Failing Today's Students. And look, he has a copy right there. So Corey, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Erika, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so we're just going to start off giving you a chance to talk about your work in sort of like a general way, especially for those who don't know anything about you and who don't even really understand the term school choice. And I think, one thing that's going to be important is that it can mean lots of different things, and there's nobody better to explain that than you. So just give us a little bit of a background on you, and also like school choice. What is it? Why does it matter?
Yeah, the way I would define school choice is allowing families to take their children's education dollars to wherever they're getting an education. So that could be the public school. If you like your public school, you can keep your public school. But if not, you could take that funding. In the U.S., we spend over $16,000 per student per year in the government-run schools. You could take that funding to the public school if you want. But if not, that funding would follow the student to a private school, a charter school, or a home-based education option. So that's the way I would define school choice: funding students as opposed to systems, allowing the money to follow the child to wherever the kid's getting the best education for them. The basic form of that is something called a voucher, which you could use to pay for private school tuition and fees. But the kind of new wave of school choice has been something called education savings accounts, which is what most bills are including that are expanding school choice in recent years, where the funding that would have followed the student to the government-run school would follow the student, instead of in the form of a voucher or scholarship, it would be in the form of an education savings account. That money could then be used for private school tuition and fees if the family wants to do that. But if not, the funding could also be used for home-based education options like homeschool curriculum, micro schools, private tutors, textbooks, educational special needs therapies, and so on, any approved education expenditure. And then as far as for me, I got into this work as a researcher at the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD in education policy with our friends Patrick Wolf, who's still at the University of Arkansas as a professor there, and Jay Green, who is now at Heritage Foundation with some of our other friends, Lindsay Burke and Jason Bedrick and Jonathan Butcher. But my first study there as a PhD student linked the Milwaukee Private School Choice Program. It's been around since around 1990, over three decades now. And we linked individual student records to their criminal records later on in life. So we were able to find large reductions in crime associated with using the private school choice program in Milwaukee by the time the students were about 30 years of age. So a long-term study, a study that looked at outcomes that not a lot of researchers are able to look at. Crime, most studies look at things like standardized test scores, which parents aren't super thrilled about. And the reason researchers do that is because they have a lot of test score information. It's a lot more difficult to get criminal records. So I started this as an academic, and I found out really quickly that although I've published about 40 peer-reviewed journal articles in academic journals, I started to find out really quickly it was an uphill battle, that the peers in the peer review process were more so my enemies than anything else. That same study that was groundbreaking on school choice reducing crime, I had a reviewer at one point tell me, and these are blind anonymous reviews, so basically what that means is they know who they're reviewing because the study is usually out there on the internet or something as a working paper, but you don't know who's reviewing you, so you can't really hold them accountable for being unfair. But their argument was, in the review, they pointed out that they thought that the methods were sound, that the relationship was causal and not correlational, but that they were going to reject it anyway because they didn't understand why I was asking that question. I was problematizing what was happening in Milwaukee And how dare I even ask whether school choice could reduce crime? So it's all about being on the right side. These institutions of higher education are more about indoctrination and ideological conformity than anything else. So instead of, fighting with these people who don't really like me all that much, I decided to go into the think tank realm, where my first think tank job was at the Cato Institute, then Reason Foundation, and now I'm at the American Federation for Children full time, where I push to fund students as opposed to systems, continue doing academic research, but also just advocate for the policies. And we've been seeing a lot of wins over the past couple of years to have the funding follow the child. And it's partially the teachers union's own fault, and people like Randy Weingarten for pushing to keep the schools closed for so long. They were able to show parents unintentionally another dimension of school quality that is much more important than what can be captured by a standardized test, which is whether the school's curriculum aligns with their values. So we're seeing a school choice revolution unfolding right before our eyes.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that. So, but before I do that, I completely forgot at the outset of this to congratulate you, Corey, because you have, I think, now been married for one day.
That's right.
Corey unexpectedly announced yesterday that he and his lovely bride had gotten married. And so congratulations are in order, and we're very happy for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was it was a pretty good it was one of my breaking news tweets. That was not an actual, school choice related tweet. Here it is. Breaking, we're married. Yeah, so Thanks for pointing that out, and it's great to be with Miranda. We actually have a bigger wedding ceremony planned in October, and we've had it planned for a while, and we just couldn't wait anymore. We just went in yesterday, and I'm so glad that we did.
Congratulations. Well, love can't wait, so bravo.
Yep,
and I have to say that a lot of us who thought maybe we would have known something like this was happening, everybody was floored, and so it made for a very exciting few minutes online. Okay, so back to this school choice. You alluded to this, but can you say more about why we're seeing such an explosion and expansion in educational freedom for parents at the state level, and maybe just give a few examples of recent wins?
Yeah, Vodi Bakum said it best. We cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come home as Romans. But the good news is now, because families got to see what was going on in the classroom, parents aren't surprised anymore. They're seeing the ideological indoctrination that happens in schools, and a lot of the same families who thought that their kids were in great public schools, maybe it was their kid was in an A-rated school by the state, maybe their kid was coming home with good grades on the report card or high standardized test results. These same parents who thought that everything was okay have started to see that everything is not okay, and their public school isn't as great as they initially anticipated. And so we've seen a lot of mobilization on the part of parents to push back at school board meetings. We see how well that works. They get labeled as domestic terrorists because the school board has no incentive to really listen to these families. And instead, they try to silence them, cut off their mics, and label them as evil people. And so parents have also taken the step to push back at the ballot box, to vote for politicians who support educational freedom and to oust politicians who come out against parental rights in education. Look what happened with Terry McAuliffe in Virginia. He said, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach at the last gubernatorial debate. And in a state that went 10 points to Biden just the year before, Glenn Youngkin, the Republican who ran on parental rights, won with education voters by 6 points, according to Washington Post exit polling. And that was the number 2 issue in the election. And so that has become politically advantageous to support parental rights in education, and has become a form of political suicide to come out against parental rights in education at this time. So that's why we're seeing a lot of the momentum. It's the political winds have shifted. And as Milton Friedman once famously said, it's not about putting the right people into office. That's not the way that you change things, although it can help in moving the ball forward. But the way that you really change things is about creating a climate of public opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And so I think it's become politically advantageous to support parents because the parents are watching what's happening. And just a quick statistic for you is last year in the midterms, there wasn't a red wave, there wasn't a blue wave, but there was a school choice wave. 76% of the candidates supported by my organization, the American Federation for Children, won their races in 2022. And we didn't just play on the easy ones. We targeted 69 incumbents at the state level and took out 40 of them. This is the hardest thing to do in politics. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can look at the liberal tiers in the New Yorker magazine, where the author lamented that education freedom candidates fared depressingly well in the midterms. They could just go cry harder, because although that's bad news for the socialists who want to control other people's kids, that is fantastic news for parents who want more of a say in their own kids' education. And so some of the states, the first couple of states that went all in last year was Arizona and West Virginia. In those states, all families, regardless of income, regardless of background, regardless of zip code, all families can now take their children's state-funded education dollars. In Arizona, for example, it's about $7,000 per student. They can take their education dollars to the education provider they're choosing, public, private, charter, or otherwise, or homeschool or micro school. The funding follows the student, all students. And same in West Virginia. And in 2023, we're already dubbing this the new year of school choice, because 4 states have already gone all in, passing universal policies. That's Iowa was first in January, and then Utah shortly thereafter, then Arkansas and Florida most recently. And Oklahoma is basically number 5 this year, because the legislature has sent the bill to the governor. Governor Kevin Stitt is a huge supporter of school choice. He'll sign it. So that'll be 5 states already universal this year. And in North Carolina, although the other 7 states that have gone all in have been GOP-controlled trifectas with the Republican governor, House, and Senate, North Carolina has a Democrat governor, but they have all Republicans signed on to a bill to fund students as opposed to systems in each chamber, giving them just enough votes to override an expected veto from Roy Cooper, the Democrat governor, who's a hypocrite on the issue of school choice, who sent his own kid to private school, which is great. I think all families should seek out the best education for their kids, but he shouldn't fight against school choice for other families. But since all Republicans have signed on, they have 2/3 majorities, which is just enough to override a veto from Governor Cooper. And just recently, I know we were talking about this a little earlier, Erika, I tweeted out a clip from Roy Cooper. Actually, the governor issued a state of emergency because he's throwing a temper tantrum because he knows he can't block Republican priorities like school choice. He issued a state of emergency on the issue of school choice. He's so he's just so terrified because he knows the special interests who control him are being threatened right now, because all families are going to have a choice. And the teachers unions who donate to Democrats overwhelmingly really don't like that. I mean, Randy Weingarten's union, she's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, who lobbied to keep the schools closed as long as possible and who threatened safety strikes over reopening schools. Over 99.9% of the campaign contributions from AFT, Randy Weingarten's union, went to Democrats in 2022. So their power structure is being threatened right now. The left is losing their minds because they're losing control over the minds of other people's kids, and they can't handle it. So it's interesting that Roy Cooper actually is abusing emergency powers to issue a state of emergency to throw a hissy fit about families getting empowered with school choice. You'd think he'd issue a state of emergency about the nation's report card scores that just came out, with 13% of kids in the U.S., 8th graders, understanding or are proficient on the NAEP in U.S. history. But of course not. The state of emergency was to help their top campaign contributors, the teachers unions.
Yeah, it's funny. You would think, that with all the schools where we see 0% proficiency in reading or 10% proficiency in reading, we don't hear states of emergency rhetoric around that. But when families are about to have an opportunity to escape the schools where nobody is learning to read or do math, suddenly now it is a state of emergency. Very concerning. I did want to add, though, we're seeing and always have known that there are lots of other reasons that parents are looking for options. It's not always that it's related to poor outcomes. It's not always that it's related to, a curriculum that's concerning or feels more like indoctrination. So what are some other reasons that you've seen over the years where parents might want their child to be able to exit the local school and go somewhere else? And I would also add that we see this within families where a school that was really, really worked well for the two older children is just absolutely not working out for the younger one.
Yeah, it might not just be the right fit for the kid and the mission of the school and what their kid is interested in or how the child learns. So one size doesn't fit all. A great public school that works for the majority of kids might not be the right fit for your individual kid for a whole host of different reasons. And yeah, it goes beyond academics and test scores and even the curriculum alignment with the family's values. A lot of families just want their kid in a safe environment. Perhaps the kid's getting bullied in one situation at the school that they're assigned to, and maybe they have a better peer network in another school, or maybe the school just has a better discipline policy that allows for a safer learning environment. So safety is part of it. And also parents might want school choice even if they don't want to exit the school necessarily. They may just want more leverage. So when they do go to the school board meetings, instead of being labeled as a domestic terrorist for pushing back, if that school board knows that you can vote with your feet and take the money with you, they may scratch their head a little bit next time and say, well, maybe we'll take these concerns into consideration, just like we see in the private market. If enough customers are upset with the product, well, the producer will have to change their game and actually have to answer your calls. Unlike with the DMV, you get on the hold all the time, and you show up, and it's kind of just like we talked about marriage, right? We went to the DMV yesterday to do the last name change. What a total mess. I'll just leave it that way. But and their attitude about it is kind of just, well, too bad. Deal with it. And that same feedback mechanism that works in the private sector doesn't work in the public sector unless you have some form of exit option, like with school choice. And so you may like your school, and maybe you think things might change in the future. And if things are going to change, and perhaps there's another pandemic, for example, and the teachers unions push to close the schools again, a school that otherwise might be a great school, well, the parents might be able to say, well, if you don't open, I'm gonna enroll somewhere else. And there actually has been a study by Michael Hartney and Leslie Finger that was published in a peer-reviewed journal, I believe in 2021, finding that public schools in places with more Catholic schools, all else equal, controlling for background demographics of the students and the areas of these schools, the public schools in those areas were more likely to open in person. And that was because at least families had some form of exit options. I believe they used Catholic schools because those are the lower cost in general private school exit options. So competition can be a rising tide that lifts all boats in the public sector on test scores, but also on basic things like, are you going to open up for in-person learning or not?
Okay, so you mentioned the teachers unions, and we do know that, they have long been in opposition of any sort of choices for parents. And they've come out strongly in opposition to the whole concept of parental rights. I've actually found the fact that their decision to antagonize parents has actually been kind of puzzling to me. So you're kind of public enemy number one for them. But I did want to mention the fact that we've also begun to see critiques coming at you and at school choice advocates and the whole concept of school choice also now from the right. So we've always seen Democrats railing against parents having more options. But can you speak a little bit also to some of the critiques that are now coming from sort of the more conservative side or the right side, or just a group of people that maybe you wouldn't have thought would be, becoming a thorn in everybody's side over this?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't the arguments that are convincing legislators to vote against school choice. When you hear a fake Republican vote against school choice, they'll list all of the leftist teachers unions talking points. They won't list the concerns from a minority group on the right. But I'll go over this argument real quickly. But just to be clear, this isn't the main reason why some red states don't have school choice. There's other arguments that are put forth. But the main one that I'll hear from some on the right is that with government shekels comes government shackles. So, and I understand the motivations for making this argument. I kind of come at school choice as a whole from an anti-government libertarian angle. But this is the textbook definition of making perfect the enemy of the good. We already have millions of kids in government-run institutions where they're being indoctrinated to like big government policy. And guess what? The government can already regulate private and home education today without school choice. And so, and they have. Look at Oregon in 1922. They outlawed private education altogether. Was that because of a school choice program? No, they didn't have any private school choice programs. It was because they had authoritarians in office who wanted to control how to raise other people's children. That's how that happened. Thankfully, in 1925, 3 years later, at the Supreme Court in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the majority of the court famously wrote in the opinion that the child is not the mere creature of the state, thankfully. But even today, you look at states that have more regulation versus less regulation. The ones that have more regulation of homeschool tend to have less school choice. New York, for example, they have the worst homeschooling laws in the country. They don't have any private school choice programs. So this is totally separate. It's because authoritarians are wanting to overreach with their power and force families to raise their kids in ways that are aligned with the left's values. And then, by the way, Randy Weingarten, who we mentioned earlier, has repeated the same talking point that, if you allow the funding to follow the child, that'll lead to more regulation of private schools. Randy Weingarten has tweeted out the same argument. Do you think she's making that argument because she's some libertarian anti-government type? No, she's a big government socialist who knows that if this argument takes hold in red states, she'll be able to block school choice, keep her gravy train going. She makes over $500,000 a year. And she'll be able to keep her monopoly going in blue states and in red states. So if you're on the side of Randy Weingarten in this, you're probably on the wrong side. So you should be on my side instead. But school choice cuts against the likelihood of government regulating private and home education in at least three ways. One, you have fewer kids in the government school system learning that big government policy is a good thing. That reduces the likelihood of them voting to regulate private and home education tomorrow. Two, if you have more people using private and home education through school choice, you'll have more people benefiting from the policy. You'll have a bigger tent, a broader coalition. And if you have more people on your side, you'll have a stronger coalition to push back against future calls for regulation. That's a win. And then three, if you have more people using private and home education through school choice, the concept becomes more mainstream. Just think about with homeschooling in the pandemic. This is another one of the silver linings of the school closures. EdChoice, another school choice advocacy group, had put out polling every month starting in April of 2020, asking a simple question: are you more or less favorable towards homeschooling than you were prior to the pandemic? And every single month that they did that poll, it was about a 4-to-1 ratio. Families and voters in general were about 4 times as likely to say that they're now more likely to support private homeschooling than to say that they're less likely to support the concept of homeschooling. So that made the concept more mainstream. School choice can do the same thing going forward with allowing more families to at least see what's going on. It will no longer be some icky thing that only a few people are doing. And then also, not all school choice bills are created equal. You shouldn't fight against all school choice because of this one concern. In general, you got to look and read the bill and see what is actually in there. If there are onerous regulations, you should push back against those regulations and fight to get them pulled out of the bill. But the model legislation that I'm pushing at the American Federation for Children and other organizations such as the Institute for Justice have specific verbiage in the bill saying that the government cannot control private and home education. We list out that they can't control the creed, curriculum, admissions processes, and otherwise of the private education provider. So those are, instead of pushing against school choice writ large, you should push to include that type of text to prevent regulations from happening in the private and home education sphere. And then one more thing is that states like Arizona, they've actually separated homeschoolers and ESA, education savings account students, out in the law to prevent any spillover from the students who take the money from the ones who don't take the money. Because some homeschoolers will say, yeah, I know I don't have to take the money, but what if the regulations kind of creep over from the other sphere? Well, one, we have never seen that happen. We've had school choice for decades in the U.S. Over 30 states have some form of private school choice. If there was evidence of that, I think you should be able to come up with that. If you're making this argument, no one ever comes up with this evidence. But then, two, in a place like Arizona, they've taken an additional step of precaution to make it clear in the law that these are two separate groups. If you're taking the money and you use it for homeschool curriculum and you're doing the same exact stuff you were doing before, you are an ESA student, not a homeschool student. This is to try to prevent any likelihood, furthermore, of spillover from one sector to the other. And as I just mentioned, this is all voluntary. There's never been a private school choice program that has forced families or schools to take the funding. So each individual family and school can and should be able to make that cost benefit decision for their own kids. But you shouldn't be able to tell another family that, yeah, I'm not going to take the money, but you can't take the money either.
Right.
That should be up to the individual families. You should mind your own business.
So I wanted to just quickly say that one important point that neither Corey nor I have really made, but is worth making, is that the teachers' unions are not the same thing as the rank and file teachers. In fact, we actually see K-12 teachers send their children, their own children, to private school at twice the rate of, the average population. Neither I nor Corey would ever begrudge a teacher for making a decision about where to send their child that's outside of the public system. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that we're talking here about teachers when we're talking about the behemoth that is the teachers union. Corey, could you just quickly give us like the 3 or 4, I don't know, like the most common arguments against school choice? I mean, I'm not even sure that they're really arguments, but you know what I mean? The talking points that we hear from teachers unions against parents having more options.
Yeah, they'll say that giving families a choice or school choice defunds the public schools. And to which I respond, the money doesn't belong to the government schools. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution, whether that's public or private. So families should be able to choose public if they want, but they don't de facto earn, they aren't guaranteed your funding. It doesn't belong to the institutions. Like, no one would ever say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Walmart. I mean, that just wouldn't make any sense, because even if you're using taxpayer funds like with food stamps or SNAP, we know that money belongs to the individual family and they can choose to take the money to Walmart if they want, but they aren't forced to do so. So it's just like that with K-12 education. The funding belongs to the kids and they should be able to pick the public school if they want. And if you're doing a good job, you really shouldn't be making this argument that this will defund the public schools, because then you'd be confident in your product. Their main argument against school choice is actually an argument for school choice. It's an admission of failure. They know that a lot of families aren't happy with what they're getting, and they have no confidence in the providers of their services in the government school system. And they really believe that the kids and the money meant for educating them belong to their institutions. They have it completely backwards. It's meant for the parents to decide. They have their kids' best interest in mind, and they know and care more about their kids better than anybody else, certainly more than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. But a more technical point on this argument that this will defund public schools is that with these programs, it's typically these are policies passed at the state level. It's the state level portion of funding that follows the student. In Arizona, I mentioned earlier, it's $7,000 per kid that follows the child. Well, the local and federal funding is also about $7,000 per student if you add those up. The public schools keep that money. They get to keep thousands of dollars for students they're no longer educating. So on a per student basis, they actually end up spending more per student for the kids who are left behind in the traditional system. So, I mean, just imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and you wanted to stop at Trader Joe's or Safeway or what have you, and Walmart got to keep half your grocery funding each week. That wouldn't make any sense. It would be a great deal for Walmart, but this is also a great deal for the public schools. They get to keep any money at all for students they're no longer educating. So this doesn't defund public schools. They're actually more well-funded on a per student basis. That's the main argument you'll hear. It's all about power. Another forward talking point. I have the best forward talking point, which is fund students, not systems. But the other side has their own, which is ridiculous. And it is public funds, public schools. Well, one, there's no such thing as public funds. It's all taxpayer dollars. But then two, these same people who rally around public funds, public schools, support public funds, so-called public funds, being used at private institutions for everything else. For higher education, they support Pell Grants. These are public taxpayer dollars that can be used at public universities if you want, but you could also take a Pell Grant to a private religious or non-religious university. Think about the federal Head Start program for pre-K. These are taxpayer dollars that can be used at private providers of pre-K, even if they're religious providers of pre-K. All of a sudden, though, in the in-between years, when it comes to those K to 12 years, the left gets all uneasy about allowing the funding to follow the child. But it's okay for higher ed and it's okay for pre-K. The reality is this has nothing to do with logic, but everything to do with power dynamics. Choice is the norm with higher education and pre-K, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest, the teachers' unions, only when it comes to K to 12 education. And we can go on and on with examples. I mean, in the food industry, you can take the public taxpayer dollars with food stamps to private grocery stores. They don't have a problem with that. When it comes to Medicaid dollars, those are public taxpayer dollars that can be used at private religious hospitals, even if you want, or non-religious hospitals. The funding follows the decision of the family or the individual. With all these other programs, except for when it comes to K to 12 education, you have these hypocrites who send their own kids to private school. We talked about Governor Cooper declaring a state of emergency over school choice because he's throwing a temper tantrum that other families are going to get education freedom. But he sent his own kid to private school. Again, I'm fine with that, but he shouldn't fight against school choice for others. Joe Biden sent his kids to private schools. Nancy Pelosi. You have Gavin Newsom. Oh, it's so prevalent that when I find a politician who opposes school choice, who's a Democrat, and I find that they didn't send their kids to private school, it's actually more surprising if that's the case. There's so much hypocrisy, and it's because they're controlled by the teachers' unions.
Yeah, and what they're actually saying is, I don't think that people with less money than me, I don't think that low-income families should have any options when it comes to where their children go to school. I mean, that really is what they're saying, and which flies in the face of all of their rhetoric. But I just feel like when you come down to it, you're thinking this is compulsory. You're assigning children to a school based on their residential address, regardless of whether that school is good or has been failing for generations, regardless if that school can meet their child's needs or not. And then to say, well, I have the money, so I'm going to put my kids in all of these other schools that I think are better than the one I'm assigned to residentially. But you, poor people, since you can't just stop being poor, we're going to make you, again, attend schools that you don't want to attend. And I find that, I mean, that gets me, like, I have a visceral reaction, as people are probably witnessing. So again, like, I want everyone to send their kids where they want to be able to send them. I just hate the idea of then closing the door or pulling up the ladder behind you because you have, more means to do so. Okay. A couple more questions. As you've traveled across the country, and I happen to know that you've literally been like zigzagging across the country for what seems like almost 2 years now. Two things I wanted to know. What are you hearing from parents on this topic? And then also, what are you hearing from legislators on this topic?
Yeah, parents want it. I mean, you just look at in Arizona, before they went universal, they had a program that was targeted to 20% of the population. When they opened the floodgates last year, they over quintupled since then the number of families using education savings accounts. So it went from about 10,000 last year to now, less than a year later, over 50,000 students benefiting from education savings accounts. So just looking at the expressed choices of families shows that this is overwhelmingly popular. You look at the polling on the issue, Real Clear Opinion Research polling most recently showed that 72% of Americans support school choice, with supermajority support among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And then politicians, it depends on who you're talking to. Republicans support it. They're all fired up about it. I was just in Minnesota. They're all locked arms about it. I was also in North Carolina, where they have all Republicans signed on as co-sponsored. They're fired up. We did a rally at the Lieutenant Governor's Mansion just a couple weeks ago, and this is a Republican Party platform issue, and it has become much more so more recently because of the curriculum misalignment problems with the public school system. School choice has always been a Republican Party platform issue, or has been for a while, but it's become much more mobilizing in recent years in particular. And politicians are also seeing that this is a political winner. Again, politicians, I would hope, would respond to logic every once in a while, but a lot of times politicians respond more to power dynamics. And what they're seeing is, for far too long in K-12 education, the only special interests really represented the employees, the adults in the system. But now the kids have a union of their own, and they're called parents. And these parents are mobilized more than ever. They're paying attention, and they're holding politicians accountable for their stance on parental rights in education. So I think that's why we've seen a lot of change recently, is that politicians are seeing this as a political winner, and some Democrats are even defecting on the issue. In North Carolina, the reason that the Republicans have a supermajority in the House, enough to override a veto, is that a sitting Democratic legislator, Tricia Cotham, actually switched parties to become a Republican on the issue of school choice. You have a Democrat in Georgia, Misha Maynard, came out in a viral video. She was just on Fox recently talking about it, where she's going to hold her ground, even though the people in the Democratic Party are trying to primary her and tell her that you can't be for parental rights in education with school choice. She's standing firm and fighting for parental rights. So we're seeing some Democrats defect. We have in Nebraska, they're hearing a bill today. It might pass on third reading to get Nebraska's first private school choice program. Well, in their unicameral, it's a pretty odd way to set up the legislature. It's just one chamber. They don't have a House and Senate. It's just one body. They have to pass a bill 3 times with 2/3 majority support. So to get controversial stuff done in Nebraska, it's pretty difficult. They've already done it twice this year. They just need to do it one more time. But in Nebraska, they have 3 Democrats who co-sponsored the bill. They need all 3 of their votes to pass the bill as well. So there's movement there. And then in the midterms, Josh Shapiro, who was Attorney General of Pennsylvania, he's now the governor. He was up in the midterms by double digits against Doug Mastriano. Josh Shapiro is a Democrat, and he flipped on school choice right before the election. He included education savings accounts in the form of Lifeline scholarships in his education platform right before the election. I wrote about this, and I got some flack from conservatives on social media who said, why are you going to bat for a Democrat like Josh Shapiro? He doesn't really believe it. He doesn't actually support school choice. He's just reading the tea leaves. And my response was, exactly. It doesn't really matter what the reason is. Whether it's because he had a true change of heart, I hope that's the case. But if not, even if it's just because he's seeing it as a political winner, that's ultimately a win for parents in the end. That it doesn't matter the reason for doing so. What matters is that politicians, high-profile politicians in a state where they were up by double digits, felt compelled to support school choice, or at least put it into their platform, is a huge one for families. We saw the same thing in Illinois. J.B. Pritzker was up, an incumbent, up by a lot, Democratic governor in the polls. And he also flipped on school choice 3 weeks before Election Day. And he answered a candidate survey supporting the state's private school scholarship program that he vowed to get rid of just in 2018 and 2017. While he was running, he vowed to get rid of the same program, and now he's supporting it explicitly in a candidate survey. And so these are all good signs. And I think the way that we might get towards bipartisanship is not through pretending that that just using lefty arguments for school choice. I think we can. You can make left and right-leaning arguments for school choice, and we have for a very long time. Has that really gotten a lot of Democrats to come along? No, it hasn't. Why? Again, because politicians respond to power more than logic. The way that things change is through hyper-partisanship in the short run will lead us towards non-partisanship in the long run. And what I mean by that is the more that the GOP leans into parental rights as a political winner in the short run, the more that Democrats are going to start to lose on the issue, like we saw with Terry McAuliffe. And like we saw, even with the National School Boards Association, that's proof that parents are a new special interest that have a lot of power. After they sent the letter to the Biden administration saying that, parents should be investigated as domestic terrorists, and they even had a threat tag created for parents by the FBI. Well, 26 states in a very short amount of time pulled out of the National School Boards Association. They don't even have a majority of states anymore. I've joked before that we should rename them the Regional School Boards Association, not the National School Boards Association anymore. But politicians are seeing these movements, and I think that's what's going to lead to nonpartisanship, bipartisanship, or school choice at least being a nonpartisan issue among elected officials. It already is among voters.
I like how you laid that out. The short term is more hyperpartisan in order to get to a long-term place of either bipartisanship or nonpartisanship.
Yep. And Erika, just real quick.
Sense, actually.
Yeah, and it requires the GOP to become the parents' party in order for the Democrats to feel the pain. Because what happens if the Republicans don't campaign on education and school choice? If they don't pull a Glenn Youngkin? Well, that gives the Democrat a pass. They don't have to make a decision between the kids' union and the teachers' union. The Democrats are actually in a catch-22 situation right now. The ones who are overly reliant on the teachers' unions, if they come out for parental rights, well, then they'll have Randy Weingarten upset at them. If they come out against parental rights, like we saw with Terry McAuliffe, well, then they have parents against them now. But if they don't have to say anything one way or the other, they have no special interest that's upset with them. And the Republicans are basically giving Democrats a pass, and they deserve to lose if they don't run on education freedom, like we saw with the blueprint for success laid out very clearly by Glenn Youngkin in Virginia.
That is a very, very interesting point. So for those of us that are in, like, I'm not just in a blue state, but I'm like in a blue state where you can almost count I think you actually can count the number of Republicans in my state on two hands. I want to say there's 9. So what's been interesting in a bad way, our current governor, of whom I was a fan for a very long time, he was a big charter school guy. You know, he founded these Rhode Island Mayoral Academies. He used to get endorsed by the union, used to endorse his Republican opponent because he was a Democrat in favor of choice. In my state, it seems like Democrats are moving more away. Like, he almost seems like he's pulled back and is really, really unrecognizable on the school choice front from maybe where he was, 10 years ago. So are you seeing that in other really blue places where, because it sounds like some Democrats are defecting and they're flipping in favor of school choice, but it seems like some Democrats that actually were pretty strong on the issue for a Democrat are pulling back. And do you see that happening? And if so, do you think it's going to continue, or do you think the pressure is going to get to a point where they can't do that anymore?
Yeah, I think it's going to get to a point where they can't do that anymore. But in the short term, they may try to quadruple down. I mean, we saw this with Terry McAuliffe, who made his campaign blunder. Instead of backpedaling right away and saying, no, I actually support parents and they actually should have a say in what their kids are learning at school, he quadrupled down and even had Randy Weingarten stumping for him the night before the election. So I think their initial reaction is a knee-jerk reaction to just hold on to power for dear life and try to continue to keep doing things the way that they've been doing and to try to gaslight the public. I mean, we're seeing this with the unions too. They've been so drunk on power for so long that they think that they could just rewrite history on school closures, for example. You had Randy Weingarten testifying before Congress under oath saying that they've been fighting to reopen the school since April of 2020. We all know that's BS. I mean, parents saw that the schools were closed into 2022 in some places. I mean, 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation. You had the Chicago teachers unions tweeting that it was racist and sexist to reopen the schools while they were having their board members vacationing, at least one of them in Puerto Rico, while saying it was not safe enough to go back to work. And all the meanwhile, you had the Catholic private schools open. You had private grocery stores open. You had their members going and shopping in those grocery stores. It was safe enough to do that, but it was safe enough for the grocery workers to go to work, but it wasn't safe enough for them to go back to work. I mean, it's just a total messed up set of incentives that's baked into the current system. So look, people who have been in power for far too long become drunk on power. And so their first reaction is going to be to hold on for dear life. But I think, and that also could have something to do with, I don't know how the Republicans act in your state, but in some states, like in New York, I remember Kathy Hochul, the Democrat, kind of defected on school choice too. She started to say that she's in favor of eliminating the cap on charter schools in New York City, for example. That was another defection, I'd say, a good step in the right direction for a Democrat. some Republicans opposed the idea in New York. So, of course, if the Republicans aren't in lockstep, like I mentioned earlier, the Democrats aren't going to feel any heat. And so they're not going to defect on the issue either. So it really depends on the Republicans leading the charge, even if they're in the minority. I was just in Minnesota. The Republicans are in the minority in each chamber, but they are gung-ho in supporting educational freedom. That might make some of the Democrats there flip, or a blue state that's pretty close, slim majorities like Minnesota, could turn into a red state next time because the Democrats lose on the issue. So, Rhode Island's much further gone than Minnesota.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's almost like even if you have the Republicans in lockstep, there just aren't enough of them. This is a state that's taken that for granted, and it seems to actually be getting worse. And I'm not saying that as a partisan. I'm saying it more like it's just been single party rule for so long. It's so entrenched, but it's been kind of depressing to watch, I have to admit. All right. So let's get to your new
another good solution is to move to Florida or Texas. Texas should be getting school choice soon.
Well, here's the problem. Even if I wanted to move to Florida, the real estate now has doubled in cost. Plus there's some other, I was reading these numbers, and it's like the real estate in all these places, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, used to be that you move from New England and you can move from a teeny little house up here and buy something big down there. Now the real estate prices are exploding.
That's right.
But it is.
People love freedom.
Understandably, believe me. Okay. So you have a new book coming out. I mean, I know I don't even think it's done yet.
This is the new book. The new one. Oh, this is kind of new still too. It's from last month.
All right, hold on. So this is the book that just came out. This is Mediocrity. Wait a minute, let me get it right. Mediocrity, 40 Ways Government Schools Are Failing Today's Students. And this is the book that you co-wrote with
Connor Boyack. He's the author of the Total Twins series and the president of Libertas Institute in Utah.
Oh, cool. Okay. And then am I right that you're also working on another book? So just tell us super briefly about that.
That should come out in a year from now. So next summer, I'm thinking early May 2024. And it's it's tentatively titled The Parent Revolution. And so what I'll go over in that, this will be my first solo authored book and it's going to be with Center Street Hachette. It's a top 5 publisher. And that one, it's going to detail a lot of the recent wins when it comes to school choice. A lot of what we talked about on the podcast today go through some examples in particular states. For example, in Iowa, Iowa, Governor Reynolds was a true advocate for educational freedom, trying to get ESAs across the finish line last year. The Senate passed her bill with all Republicans except for one in favor. And so easily passed their Senate, moved over to the House, and failed to move anywhere despite having a 60-40 GOP majority in the Iowa House. She went out and primaried a bunch of those fools and cleaned up house. And one, for example, one of the incumbents that got ousted, who was an opponent of school choice, was Dustin Haidt. He was the chair of the House Education Committee. And I think he ended up losing like a 70-30 race. It was a total blowout, which is really hard to do for someone in a leadership position, a chair of a committee, and in addition, someone who's an incumbent. It's really hard to do that. So they ended up passing universal school choice, the first state to do so this year in 2023. So she didn't win the battle last year, but she ended up winning the war, and it had a lot to do with the political dynamics. So we'll go over some of the wins. I'll go over just the basic argument for school choice and funding students as opposed to systems, and a lot of other fun stuff, including things that have happened on some of my trips and some of the battles I've experienced with Randy Weingarten, for example.
Well, then it's clearly going to be, you can't miss this book, because who doesn't want to read about Corey's battles with Randy Weingarten? All right, we're pretty much about to wrap up, but any final thoughts or anything I didn't ask you about that you would have liked to have talked about with our audience?
Yeah, so I mentioned I live in Texas now. We have a bill that has passed through the Senate 18-13, very easily passed. Nearly universal school choice. It would be a huge win. Gold standard of school choice policy. It's an education savings account. It has been stalled in the House for quite a while, despite Republicans having a majority. So you might ask the question, well, what's going on in the Texas House? Well, this has happened as well in other red states, but primarily in Texas, which is the biggest one where this has unfolded. Is the Texas Senate passed an ESA back in 2017. They had the votes before it was cool to do so, before the COVID stuff kind of played out. And the House blocked it last time, didn't even give the bill a hearing. Well, we got a hearing this year. The political winds have shifted in our favor. 88% of Republican primary voters on the Texas ballot supported school choice last year, which was up 9 percentage points since it was last on the ballot in 2018 in Texas. And the argument you'll hear as an excuse for fake Republicans to vote against their party platform issue is they'll say, I'm in a rural district, and on the one hand, my constituents really can't use this. We don't have any private school choice schools in our area. They'll say that the public school is the only option in my area. They'll say that. And in the next breath, with a straight face, they'll try to say, giving families a choice, school choice will destroy or decimate my fantastic rural public school. Well, one, if the school is so fantastic, you should have nothing to worry about. But then two, if it's true that you don't have any exit options, the public school is the only option, you should be the last person making the argument that this will decimate your public schools, because families will continue going to that same fantastic rural public school. And so this is actually the area with the weakest argument against school choice, on the grounds that it'll defund the public schools because they have the fewest exit options. So this is just an excuse for fake Republicans who are endorsed or funded by the teachers unions to vote against their party platform issue. It's just as simple as that. But this is the argument that they'll try to have their cake and eat it too, by laying out this argument to try to provide an excuse to provide air cover. But if you look at the 9 most rural states in the country, I've tweeted them out. They've all passed some form of private school choice program. So this isn't a legitimate excuse. It's been fine there. West Virginia, for example, we mentioned earlier, one of the most rural states in the country, they have a universal school choice program now. That wasn't an excuse that worked for their legislators. And in fact, the Republicans have expanded their majorities to supermajority in each chamber since they've passed universal school choice. So it's a political winner. The rural argument's no good. If you look at the polling, if anything, voters in rural areas, according to the latest polling I've seen out of Texas from the University of Houston, the rural voters are actually more supportive of school choice than voters in other areas. And then, in fact, 2 of the states the 2 states with the oldest voucher programs in the country, Maine and Vermont, they had programs that started in the late 1800s called town tuitioning programs that were specifically designed for students in rural areas that didn't even have public schools. So because they didn't have options, this was actually an argument to provide more options. So they gave the funding to the families. These programs are still on the books today, and you could use it for another public school in a nearby district, or you can use that funding in the form of a scholarship to go to another private school as well. So some of the earliest forms of school choice in the country were designed because there weren't a lot of options in the area. This is an argument for choice, not against it.
Well, you convinced me a long time ago, though, I must say. In fact, most of my battle scars are from my advocacy for parents having more options. So what people may not understand is that before all of the new issues were out and everybody was arguing about those, there were it's been like a bloodbath in the trenches over getting parents more options, even if they don't have enough money to pay for them on their own. Okay, so lastly, if parents would like to get more information on what choices are available in what states, or resources in general on this subject, where could you point them?
Well, if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's always great. It's at DeAngelis Corey. But if you want to help us in the fight for education freedom, you can take the Education Freedom Pledge, which is very simple. You go to educationfreedompledge.com.
Okay. And any other questions anybody may have, you can always reach out to us at PDE, and we will gladly forward them all to Corey, since he's not busy at all, and he will get back to us with answers. All right. Well, then again, congratulations on the unexpected nuptials. We're very happy for you. Thank you for providing our audience with all of this information on a subject that I still find to be confusing, and I've been working in it for years. And we'll have you back when the book comes out.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, Erika.
Thanks, Corey. Take care.